Hi, and welcome back to the Anthropology of Music and Sound. Today we're looking at Week 10 ideas in our class as we near the end of the quarter. So for Week 10, we'll talk about a variety of issues. We'll look at music and capitalism, specifically focusing on the idea of brands and how brands are often connected to sonic and auditory and musical moments. We'll talk a little bit about performance. We'll look at everyday life contexts of sound and music, and we'll also talk about music and pop culture. As usual, I'll take you through some additional demos and sonic examples as much as I can explore them here in my studio and through some other opportunities here online. So I want to talk a little bit this week about generative music. Now, generative music refers to a type of music that is changing, that's being altered, even being created through principles of randomization, such that you get the sense that the music never is static. There's not a repetition of a motif as we might hear in a lot of traditional music. Instead, there's a focus on this notion of flux that actually kind of connects to the 60s movement called Fluxus, which was very much interested in blurring art and life, in creating performance moments that really didn't seem at any level different from everyday life, which is kind of one of the foci here looking at generative music. I encourage you to look at the readings and also the work in the media section of Brian Eno, who came up with a lot of ideas related to generative music, talking about how music itself could blend into everyday life such that you might not even perceive that music is being played in a particular environment. It's just sort of a part of that environment. It could be randomized. It could be created by principles of randomization, as we'll explore here in a second with my Eurorack setup. It could, again, focus on flux and could be ever-changing, such that you never get a sensibility that there's repetition of a motif or of anything similar happening in one moment of the composition, the next moment, and the final moment of it. And then could also be based on process, where a particular process, such as the Turing machine, as we'll talk about here in an example, can be used to create forms of randomization, chance, or flux, such that, again, you get non-repetition happening throughout the performance. Now, in a second here, we're going to jump and look at some of my examples in my Eurorack setup of doing generative music, including using a biofeedback module called the Scion from Instruo. If you're interested, you could check out this interesting program I linked for you this week called Nodal. It's free to use for a certain period of time, I think for 30 days. And once you have set it up, you're going to see this grid. And this is a very interesting grid system of music composition that uses a lot of different principles. So I encourage you to experiment with this, to take that experimental focus of this class to examples here with Nodal. Now, if you'd like to see some examples of how this works, you can actually click on the File menu at the top left corner, it's off screen now, and open one of these examples. And this will show you what is involved here, and then we can hit play. You should hear this playing. Put on my headphones to hear. So indeed, it is playing. And what's curious about this is you can go in and actually adjust any of these networks that are playing. And you can go in here and use principles of randomization for any of the nodes. And I have to say, it's not something I have a lot of familiarity with, but if you want to check this out, if you want to explore some examples, you could take these and alter them. And once you change the position of these on the grid, you see you're altering the sound itself. And I'm literally just dropping and dragging stuff. And we get some very aleatoric type of music being played. So kind of cool. If you want to check that out for this week, I encourage you just to click on that link for Nodal. It's the free synthesizer, and you can download it and play with it a little bit. There are some additional generative music sites that I've also included in an earlier set of links for the class. So if you're interested in exploring those, definitely check those out. Now let me jump onto my Eurorack setup to show you a little bit of how I approach generative music in my own Eurorack setup. Okay, so we can have a look at the approaches that we can take to creating our own generative music. Again, We're looking here at music that could be ever evolving, changing, constantly in flux, even determined by random processes, which is one approach I like to take because it creates such an interesting array of opportunities for your sound. It never gets dull. As an example, we could start with a basic drum patch here. It's being triggered by a very straightforward beat that is not changing. And so what I could do here is actually route it to a modulation source, and I have randomization going on inside of this module as well. It's going to get very crazy here because it's not just a random signal created by my Turing machine here, but inside this drum module there's randomization going on. So every time this is getting a trigger or a voltage, it's altering a different parameter here, so you get these incredibly crazy timbres and sound effects. So it's not necessarily useful musically, but what I think is very interesting about using random sources and creating generative music is you're really increasing the possibilities of your music at the level of the rhythm, at the level of modulation, at the level of timbre and sound, because really the sky is the limit in terms of working with a lot of these generative devices. Now next I'm going to use this 4-voice FM operator, and we're also going to be using our Turing machine to create some randomization. I'm not just using the output of the Turing machine to impact the sound here of this 4-voice module. I'm actually running that into another randomization module, which is going to allow me to further randomize the properties of the sound that you're hearing here, and you'll get an example of this right now. And actually I want to dial it back and start at the very beginning of this patch. So you're hearing randomization again coming from this Turing machine algorithm. And so maybe I can dial it in. I get a sequence that I want to keep, like something like that. Now, again, I'm taking what we call just the clock signal, so the changes will be in time here. It's going into another randomization module, and I can take a series of random signals from this particular module, so I can take a random pulse output and plug that into my second voice. And I can even bring in my other voices here. I have 2 voices you're hearing now. I can bring in 2 more voices. Which don't sound very good, but once I do some more modulation of those voices, you'll hear kind of some cool potentials for the sound here. Maybe I'll take one more voice. We'll take a sample and hold out. And to further mix things up, I can actually bring in another module which gets a little interesting. So I have this module here called Scion by Instruo. It uses a TENS cable, and this is a particular cable that will pick up biofeedback signals. So I actually have a green bean that I've attached to my sensors, and so the green bean is going to actually then affect the voltages that are coming out of that module. So what I'll do with that additional modulation source is bring it in to further affect the randomization of many of the parameters of the sound. Now we're getting some of that good signal, again being modulated by the green bean. Take a few additional outputs from my Instruo module that is again being created through that green bean. Getting some really nice effects on the sound here, which is exactly why I like using a module like that uses the biofeedback cables. So again, that was an exploration of using randomization principles and generative music principles in the Eurorack setup. In particular, I like using that Instruo module called Scion because using biofeedback systems is a really great opportunity to bring in some randomization and some life, if you will, and some chance and some flux into a musical composition or performance. So hopefully you can use this focus on generative music this week as an inspiration, at least in a conceptual sense, as you think about music and sound in your own everyday life context. So one of the important topics for this week is the connection of music and capitalism. And of course, talking here, you'll probably get some perspectives of Marxism as you do some of the readings this week. You'll also likely want to connect this topic to consumer and pop culture. So we've actually been addressing a lot of these issues throughout the quarter. For example, we've talked about auto-tune. We've talked about standardization. We've talked about how a lot of our choices in music become automated via technology. It could be computer technology. It could be app-based technology. We'll continue that focus this week talking about Spotify and how the playlist has really redefined our perspectives on music as much as how, say, the turntable, the record player, the record itself redefined music back in the day, or how the radio did, or other variations of technology as we've moved forward. So I really encourage you this week to think very critically about how music is maybe less than a choice and more of a matter of style or taste or something that emerges through our interactions with one another and various media forums and consumer forums in a consumer society and in popular culture. So for this week, let's talk about Spotify. And we've had some conversations in the past about Spotify. I mentioned to you this interesting revenue estimator that you can log on to. For example, I could look at a band that I don't think is a very popular band. It's one of my favorite bands, King Crimson. It shows you how much estimated yearly income and how much monthly income. So you compare that maybe with a bigger artist. I was going to look up Kanye West. And they also give popularity indicators. You can see just how much more yearly income is generated through Kanye West songs, $1.74 million. I was just going to look up another artist. Machine Gun Kelly, maybe. Annually is 602,000. So what you can do is just look up your favorite artists and see exactly maybe how they fit into this like economic stream. And of course, talking about the difference between major players, individuals like Machine Gun Kelly or Kanye West, who make a ton of money and have a whole media arm apparatus where they are basically not just a musician, but someone who has a media persona. It's a much different kind of dynamic. You can look at independent musicians, you can look at people who don't have a very big footprint and ask some important questions this week about how much the algorithms that are part of all our streaming services, whether it's Apple Music or Spotify or Pandora, how much these algorithms are really defining us more than we're defining ourselves, and then using the computer-driven algorithms to help us sort of go through the clutter and noise and find the artists that are maybe similar to these artists that we enjoy. So definitely quite a few questions to ask this week connected to Spotify. We can ask, for example, how much has music streaming altered our musical and sonic landscape? So to what extent, as we move from the compact disc, from cassettes and records, into MP3s, which were on iPods, iPads, other devices, and now on our phones, but more so it seems like we're less archiving music. And there's an interesting article you can check out on Spotify and sort of this transformation, movement away from archiving music into playlists and our reliance on an algorithm to predict an artist that we like. And we can put in a favorite artist. I do this all the time on Pandora, and then it will play other artists similar to that artist or to that musical style. And it really raises a question: how do these algorithms work? How do they define our music? How do they understand connections between one genre and another, a related genre, or one artist and another related artist? You can also look at the kind of computer side of this if you want to get into how the algorithms actually work on Spotify. It could be another interesting topic. Another question for us with Spotify and all these streaming services: to what extent do streaming service algorithms impact our taste, our sensibilities about the music that we like or dislike? So are we being influenced by the technology? We'll talk about this in a bit when I discuss the work of the Frankfurt School, the very famous group of individuals, Horkheimer, Erich Fromm, Theodor Adorno, and all these individuals were really interested in the idea that even though we assumed in a consumer society and a democratic society that we're making our own choices, they were very fearful that the very forms that we're involved with, not unlike how the Nazis used radio as a propaganda device, these very forms are influencing our freedoms. And thus, Erich Fromm's book, Escape from Freedom, that I had up just a second ago, indicates that we're more likely to align ourselves with sort of the totalitarian impulses of consumer society, even though we live in a so-called democracy. So this is really my concern in talking about streaming services, because I think we have the perception that because we've put in our choice, the artists that we like, the algorithm will spit back everything else related. Well, making the connection of what's related and what's not is itself a very precarious choice or decision that a computer makes. You can go back to that conversation we had a while ago, 1 or 2 weeks ago, where we looked at that map, that music map, which really gets into different genres and artists. That I think gets very interesting, because the question becomes, can a computer do the operations necessary to find artists that are similar to, or genres that are similar to, those that we enjoy? Another question is, how has social media impacted the ways in which we interact with others through music? Has it impacted our taste in music? In 2021, There have been so many conversations about the negative influences of Facebook, of Instagram on our lives, whether it relates to political coups, to the insurrection in January, almost a year ago in 2020, where the terrorists attacked the Capitol, the focus on sort of image that we get in Instagram, young girls and young boys being influenced by certain images that are propagated on these platforms. So Facebook has come under a lot of fire, and in particular with their movement towards this new meta concept of the metaverse. The concern, I think, is going to be when we start to interact with others in this metaverse, with our avatars, playing games, we will be hearing sounds. What sort of sounds, what sort of music will we be hearing? When I use my exercise bike, it has a whole curated playlist that I can listen to, but I have very little choice over that music. So the question about who makes it on a playlist and who doesn't, and to go back to our revenue calculator, we realize then that if you're one of the top artists in the world, you can make so much money just through your playlists on Spotify and Pandora, on Apple, etc. Not unlike these influencers. If you remember the Fire Festival, one of the controversial things about that was all the models and influencers like the Jenner kids, they were involved in tweeting, and one tweet from one of those Jenner kids can be worth like $250,000 to that person. So it shows you how much investment we have in social media for many aspects of our lives, not just music, but certainly in the case of music. If you go onto Facebook and you start getting suggestions for artists, there's also this issue of the cookies on our media, on our phones, that are tracking our tastes, that are tracking our interests. And by the way, if you're interested in taste from a sociological perspective, I really recommend the work of Pierre Bourdieu, his book Distinction, where he talks about habitus, which is a connection of taste, of affect, of all our desires in pop culture that connects to our social class and our identity, forms of identification in society that we maintain often through popular culture, through consumer culture, and so forth. So I think Spotify will give us a lot of interesting connections to make this week. So take advantage of all those connections that you might be familiar with. Now, I've included one of the readings here, part of The Sounds of Capitalism, and this book focuses heavily on advertising. As they say here, music and advertising has helped make us into the consumers we are. Music's relationship to the body and its ability to address listeners emotionally have made it a powerful tool for advertisers, at least since the rise of broadcasting in the 1920s, so going back to radio culture. So as you look at this book, you might look at some of the specific ways in which this connects to some of the later conversations we'll have this week about branded sounds, branded memes that are visual, but in our case, we're talking about auditory memes. And he's very interested also in the work of Adorno here and how Adorno has really cautioned us about these ideas that consumer culture maybe appears to be a source of freedom and choice, but in reality, there aren't a lot of choices. As an example, in his book, The Stars Down to Earth, he looks at how people read astrology columns and make the assumption that it's about them, but he says there's a really interesting trick going on where, in fact, you assume that the astrology column or reading is personalized when, in fact, it's really not. And let me show you a later slide I have on this, because I think it's pretty interesting when we get into the context of freedom and capitalism and the extent to which we believe that we have control over our lives. And in this week's case, it's maybe the assumption that we have control over our choices when we listen to music on a streaming service like Spotify. So when we talk about the consumer side of things, if you look at Adorno's work on jazz, and by the way, Adorno wrote some experimental compositions. He certainly understood music theory and music composition. But the idea here is he talks about jazz being a pseudo-democratic form, suggesting that when people are soloing and doing all sorts of embellishments, because there's a very set pattern of chord progression and the number of beats, maybe the number of bars in a particular phrase that you're playing in a jazz standard, because of that, it really is the notion of freedom in disguise. We assume that improvisation frees us from the jazz form and frees us from constraints, but in fact Adorno was very negative on jazz and said that it really is a conformist musical form. I don't personally agree with that, but I see Adorno's point, because again, Adorno is saying a lot of forms of consumer culture are really embedded with this notion that we have freedom and we have choice, when in fact perhaps maybe our choices are being made for us, as we'll talk about in a second with this old documentary but very relevant called The Merchants of Cool. So a little more there. You can read the entire work or the selections from The Sounds of Capitalism. And again, this book really gets into the idea of using sonic cues and advertising musical cues to try to influence, to make an emotional appeal over a rational one. So I think that's one side of music that we haven't considered this week, is this notion that music and sound are influencing our decisions. Maybe we go into a store and there's a certain, we'll talk about Muzak later, there's a certain type of elevator music being played or something that might influence us to make a consumer decision. The music that you hear, the palette of choices these days is much wider than in the past. If you go into H&M or a store like that, I'm thinking of the one in Vegas where there's a whole DJ setup, you're actually getting stylistically much different music, but maybe that music and the sound use is still influencing you to make a purchase. And H&M, I think, has a very specific appeal to younger consumers and hipper, cooler consumers than, say, going into a Nordstrom where they might have a pianist playing a live piano, which used to be the case years ago. I haven't seen a live pianist in a Nordstrom in ages. But this appeal to emotions and to mood and not to our rational side of things really takes us into this realm of considering the negative sides of how music and sound influence our presumed freedoms and choices in a consumer society. Definitely check out this old Frontline video called The Merchants of Cool. I used to show this in my classes all the time. There's a focus here on coolness and how these cool hunters go out and try to find the latest band or latest style and market it. And they use ICP, Insane Clown Posse, and the Juggalos as an example in here. And ICP, I think when they first started, and there's a lot of concerns about their lyrics, their homophobia, and so forth. But when they first started, as well as their misogyny, but when they first started, there was really sort of this subcultural side of them. And then over time, they became more and more influential. They were on wrestling, pro wrestling, and really got quite popular. So the thesis of Merchants of Cool is that coolness is something to be discovered, and once you discover something cool and subcultural, you make it mainstream and you sell it. And this is the concern from the audio or musical sonic side of things this week, is what happens when our favorite band becomes super popular? Do we lose interest? Do they become part of this consumer pop culture machine, to go back to the Frankfurt School folks, that is really hitting us over the head with purchase this or follow our lifestyle or follow our values? We're very influenced, it seems, not just from pop culture and media and marketing influences, but of course social media. So we also want to bring in social media to the conversation, which wasn't as developed when this video came out ages ago. So I think really what we're getting into this week, talking about consumer choices and consumer freedoms and maybe a lack thereof, is this notion of how lifestyles, moods, and values are connected with brands. So if you have an iPhone, you know, an iPhone connotes a certain thing about lifestyle. It has a sensory appeal, even the tactile dimensions of it. We can talk about it later in terms of sounds and how the sounds themselves really have brand association. This whole idea of a sensory expression of a brand that's also connected to a lifestyle or a mood is really considered in a lot of work out there, works like Brand Sense. I actually reviewed this book ages ago, and this is talking about how touch, taste, smell, sight, and sound can be used to get people to connect to specific brands. So when you go into a store, you go into what I call a themed space, and you experience the smells of something, going into a Lush cosmetic store and you smell something, that has a real brand connection to you that not only then ties with the brand, but ties with certain lifestyle association, moods, values, assumptions about how you should be as a person, assumptions about what you should do, assumptions about your specific demographic, where you come from, and maybe your interests and even your politics. So a lot to say this week about the sensory expressions of brands as they connect to lifestyle, mood, and value. And of course, sound is our primary focus in this class. Now, another side of this is the work of Joel Beckerman, and I'll talk about in a second how I've had the chance to work with Joel. He's the author of The Sonic Boom. The subtitle is How Sound Transforms the Way We Think, Feel, and Buy. I've worked with Joel in the past, and I'll show you a presentation we did together with the architect Gordon Grice. But Joel has a company formerly called Man Made Music. Now they're called Made Music Studio. And it's a studio in New York City that does a ton of sonic branded design for companies around the world. For example, they did the music for the Dallas Cowboys, and specifically they created it in such a way where different plays in a game could be connected to different sonic explorations. They did music for NPR, for CBS, for so many different commercial entities out there. And his book is super interesting because he gets into principles of sonic branding. And I can give you a few of these, and I'll encourage you to look at Joel's work this week and look at some of his video interviews in our media section. For example, he says, make sound matter, create anthems, not jingles. You know, jingles are these little bits of sound that I think have a negative connotation in today's day and age and maybe seem a little more manipulative than authentic. I think when we think about our bands and our favorite artists, we want to think about authentic values, authentic sonic, not cues, but sonic connections, as opposed to a jingle that's selling us something. If you take a band that is much maligned, like Maroon 5 or a band like that, often I think people say they degrade those bands because they make the assumption that the music is shallow and it's inauthentic and it's just geared at a very pop culture lifestyle. Not saying that's true of that band, but you know, I've certainly heard that about them. Curate your own soundtrack. Make the sound work harder. So maybe make the sound have deeper, what he calls sonic triggers that turn a forgettable experience into something memorable and meaningful. So when you hear your favorite band, can you apply that to branded sound where you hear something and it has a meaningful connection with you as opposed to something sounding very annoying or unpleasant? Talks about silence being power. We've talked about John Cage before in this class. Talks about dumping sonic trash. The example of this is the Sun Chips bag. And so for this week, click on the alternative media. And in fact, when the Sun Chips bag came out, it was very environmentally friendly, but it was so darn loud that people started to parody the sound of the Sun Chips bag online. And I've included that particular video that has that sound, and you'll see exactly what Joel is talking about here. Avoid common sonic branding mistakes. And he goes on, and a really engaging book. I encourage you to read it if you get the chance. A lot of great information there if you want to understand the connections between sound and brands. And if you get a chance, you can look at the website of Made Music Studio. And it has a lot of information about the work that Joel does with this company, very large company. I've had a chance to talk with them on Zoom when we were prepping for our workshop, and they have some really amazing spaces, mixing consoles, sound stages and so forth. This shows you some of their clients that they've worked on in the world of entertainment, and you can click on this and it'll take you through the kind of their whole sound design and what they've done. And so these are some of them, the Hulu theme, the HBO theme. So really iconic themes. And, you know, we hear a lot of these themes sonically multiple times a day. Every time I turn on Hulu or Netflix, I hear those distinctive sounds, the startup sounds. And how many times then does that get in my head? And Joel is very interested in the cognitive side of things, sort of the cognitive science of the sonic world and how this connects to our ability to, say, recognize the specific brand that we come to associate with these various sonic memes, if you will, that we hear throughout our everyday lives. So a really cool website. I encourage you to check that out and check out the work of Made Music Studio. Now, a couple years back, as I mentioned, kind of connecting to sensory design, had a chance to work on an article with Joel from Made Music Studio and also Gordon Grice, who's worked at Forak, and he's an architect who works in themed and entertainment industries. And so we wanted to write an article that talked about how the senses can be used in branded worlds, in themed and consumer worlds. So specifically, we looked at smell and some considerations about smell and its use in design, touch, or what we call haptics, vision or sight, and then we have taste, and more specific to us, hearing or sound. And this is kind of interesting here, what we wrote about here, the idea that cacophony could breed confusion. Sound is the hidden driver of narrative focus. So one of the challenges if you go into a loud space is if there's no sonic differentiation between what you're hearing. Just like we've said, if you're mixing a track and you don't really attend to the different frequency spectra, such as your high, mid, and low frequencies, you're going to get a muddled mix. Likewise, if you walk into a space and there's a bunch of noise and you can't make out one sound from another, that cacophony will not allow you to do effective storytelling, the kind of stuff that Disney talks about, of course, in their spaces. Sound is the organizer of the senses. It's often a first impression. You walk into H&M, you hear the DJ laying down tracks, and then you're like, okay, this is connoting a certain lifestyle or mood or association or value with me, and maybe I'll buy some cool H&M clothing. Silence is our design white space, so leaving silence in a musical composition or leaving silence in a design space that has a lot of auditory cues really allows for people to take in what they've just heard before they go on to the next sound or song. It's not about sound, it's about the cohesive multisensory experience that we're creating. So how do all the senses work together? And you must consider the higher role of sound during the concept stage or opportunities are lost. So when you're designing things, really think carefully about the sonic role that is going to be played by music, sound, environmental kinds of projections of the auditory world. So we had a chance years ago, in addition to writing this article together, we also presented at IAAPA, which is the big amusement industry conference. So I've included the entire workshop we did. We did a hypothetical scenario for designers out there focused on creating a space-themed space, like a NASA space-themed space, an outer space theme, if you will. So I encourage you to look at some of that work. So another side of things this week is we can talk about everyday life and music, and we'll connect this, of course, to branded association. So one thing I encourage you to do this week is to really listen to this video from Wired that focuses on the most iconic or common tech sounds. As you listen to these various sounds, think about the role that these play in your everyday life in terms of your associations with the brand, a certain product, even a certain activity. There's an article I think I included, maybe I didn't include that, but there is an interesting discussion of to what extent Harley Davidson tried to patent the distinctive sound of their engine. And I think what happened was enough people on the board who makes these decisions, industry people, said they didn't agree with it. And maybe they felt like it was so unconventional getting into, patenting the sound of something that they were concerned that this was going to lead into a really challenging copyright trademark world in the future. Now, one of the things we can do is, and they talk about this in that video, is we can start to look at the sounds that are around us in terms of various brands. So I encourage you to do this week as you walk around your house or apartment, wherever you live, your car, you're at school or at work. Listen to the sounds that have a distinctive connection to a brand. Not all of them do. Now, I could say every musical device or sonic device has its own quality. So a Blue microphone versus a Neumann microphone, which is more expensive, or a Mackie mixer versus a Tascam mixer or something. But interesting to think about the branded connections of sounds and even getting down to what ringtones do we use when we hear the phone going off. And even the names of these, like that is called crystals. So there's an interesting, it's not onomatopoeia, but there's an interesting maybe association if you hear a certain sound and you think that does kind of sound like crystals, or this sounds cosmic. A night owl. Maybe not all of these have an immediate connection, but I think looking at something as simple as the sounds that we use, that's probably the worst one. I use that typically for my alarm, but it's not very pleasant. Maybe I'm going to switch my ring to that. It's called Radiate. So in any case, what you can do this week is look at some of the sonic devices or technologies around you. If, a car has a certain sound to it, if it beeps. There was a car I remember renting years ago called the Sonata that played a little kind of, sonata when it revved up, when it started up, and I found it a little hokey and corny, but I think it was part of their branded design for the automobile. So many opportunities this week to think about branded sound, so I definitely encourage you to get involved and maybe do a sonic profile of all the branded sounds in your space, including Hulu when you turn on a TV, or your computer when you turn on your computer, or your phone, or anything else, your watch, and try to make a profile of that and maybe make a list and analyze it a bit. I think that'd be a great topic for the open discussions this week. Another aspect of this is everyday sound and just things we hear in our environment that maybe don't necessarily have a branded connection. Muzak is an example of this. Now, Muzak goes back to, I believe, the 30s, and the company has changed over time and eventually kind of went bankrupt and sold, and started doing original artist stuff as opposed to kind of these very iconic but kind of boring sounding orchestras. We call sometimes this music elevator music because the assumption is that when you're in an elevator, you want to hear something soothing. Now, the question becomes, is music really soothing? So one of my experiments this week for you is I took a series of Muzak tracks and I put them in two devices this week. So my ARP 2600, which is an iconic synthesizer, and what you're going to hear at the beginning of this is the sound is going into a preamp here. And then what I'm doing is I'm using that sound actually directly in all the various blocks of the synthesizer. So it's a fairly unique sound in terms of running it through an actual synthesizer. And you can't do this with every synthesizer out there, taking that audio in and manipulating it. Secondly, you're really going to see this device called the Morphogene from Make Noise really come into play. So the Morphogene is a tape machine, if you will, tape recorder on steroids or on acid. And I encourage you to look at the work of Curtis Rhodes, who talks about the different time frames in his book on music and time, because the Morphogene manual actually, Make Noise, the company making this, quotes Curtis Rhodes. And so what they were really creating was something truly revolutionary in terms of sonic design. So what I'm doing here is I've loaded in 4 tracks onto a micro SD card from these Muzak reels, and then I'm manipulating it with all the various time manipulation methods, which I have no other device in my studio that can do exactly what the Morphogene can do. So I just want to show you two things is, can you take Muzak and make it more pleasant? I don't know if this is more pleasant. And then secondly, how can we manipulate sound in new ways, including the sounds of our everyday world, our everyday environments? And I encourage you certainly, if you ever want to get into this, for projects or other connections, to think about taking your field recordings, as we talked about field recordings in my one video recently, and utilizing them in some of your own projects. It's one way to transform, maybe take some agency back in a consumer society that defines all these sensory moments for you from the get-go, perhaps limiting your choice, as the Frankfurt School folks talk about. So maybe this is one way to reclaim some agency, kind of using that ideology we've talked about in the past of remixing, going back to that great film, The Remix Manifesto. So this was my sonic experiment this week. So that was my interpretation of taking Muzak and redoing it. I don't know what you thought of that. I don't know what I think of it, but it is an interesting use for me because I'm really trying to look at the morphogene as a tool that can take a lot of these everyday sounds and transform them in some really incredible senses. Now, I also want to talk just about ICU sounds, and I just would encourage you to look at the work of Joel Beckerman again on sonic humanism. Have some connections to this years ago, just a loved one who was in the ICU for quite a while. One of the things that struck both of us was how the sounds there were so harsh. And part of this is practicality. The idea is that doctors and nurses and medical practitioners need to know if your heart rate drops, or if you had an operation and your fluid levels are too high or too low, or your salt levels, whatever is being monitored with all your vitals on all these screens and monitors that are present in an ICU. These alerts, not unlike the sound if you're backing up and you're going to hit something with one of your vehicles that has a motion detector or a camera, these are very vital. This could be the difference between life and death and someone being injured if they don't get the right treatment based on what those alert sounds are indicating. So I'm not suggesting that we don't need alert sounds, but Joel, what he's getting at with sonic humanism is this idea that maybe we can change these sounds to make them equally indexical or symbolic of what they're conveying. This is an alert. Someone's heart rate is low. You must give them immediate attention or they're going to be injured or will die. But maybe you can make it iconic and symbolic, but more pleasant. So the types of sounds, not unlike the ringtones on our phones that we get to choose from, maybe we can alter this in some way. So I would encourage you to think about this and encourage you to think about sonic humanism as it relates to all forms of your everyday life. So what other contexts would you say like to replace the sounds with a different palette or set of sounds? What would those sound like? Would those be electronic sounds? Would those be organic sounds? Would those be sounds of nature? Would those be sounds of a different approach that maybe we haven't heard of before? So the character of sound could be applied to these situations where we need alerts and warnings to remind us of something very important. Again, on our phones, we have choices we can make. Should those same choices be available to people in various industries that are charged with very important tasks like keeping us alive and keeping us from becoming injured or whatever? So warning sounds and alerts are another interesting angle of everyday sounds in our everyday lives this week. So definitely encourage you to take on that issue if you want, maybe in the open discussions for this week. So let's look now at the readings and the media for this week. And there's, I think, a really good selection that you're going to enjoy. So we're looking at week 10 readings. And as you know by now, don't try to read every single reading. Again, I'm providing these for you as an archive that you can download and enjoy later in your life if you're doing research or just fun reading. So the section on generative music, my little sample for this week, you can check out Brian Eno's lecture and then this introduction to generative music. If you're interested in everyday life context, look at the Galloway article and also the Denora reading. As you know, browse through it and find an interesting section. Now, when we get into all the focus on everything from capitalism, branding to sonic humanism, as I mentioned before, check out Sounds of Capitalism, check out Thompson's work, The Soundscape of Modernity, and then there's a whole set of articles on branding, so about 12 different articles to choose from. So they're all different. Take a look at one and post about it on your text discussion. And then there's a little bit of work here describing Joel's work on the sonic boom, the book I mentioned to you today. And then quite a few readings on Spotify. Check those out. And then if you're interested, you could read Adorno's work on jazz, available here as a PDF. And then finally on urbanism, if you're interested in urban contexts of everyday life, you can check out any of these readings on urbanism. And I think urbanism is interesting to go back to Joel's notions about cacophony in that article we wrote together. Because the issue becomes if people are walking in a city and they're bombarded by all these cacophonous sounds and sounds that are maybe damaging to their ears, maybe they need earplugs or something, then the question becomes, can we redesign the sonic landscapes of our cities if they're unpleasant? The challenge there, to go back to noises, some of us might find some of the sounds of the city to be enjoyable. Cacophony, of course, is not objective. People have different opinions and views on what is a noise versus something pleasing. So because of that difference, it becomes really challenging to think in a communitarian sense about how to come to some decisions maybe as a community if we're talking about sound pollution or noise in our city spaces, wherever we happen to live. So quite a few media selections this week. The Sounds of Capitalism, you can look at Tim Taylor's work here, interviewed by Kennedy. Spotify, there's quite a bit here on Spotify to check out. The Sun Chips example is included here, and then quite a few of Joel's examples that I included here as well. And I think at the bottom here, I put our particular creating exciting attractions by making spaces immersive, experiential, and sensory panel from IAPA. Here's the track on Muzak if you want to listen to some Muzak just to relax or not relax. There are some generative music documentaries and media creation tools. Here's The Merchants of Cool, which only plays in Google Chrome. I definitely recommend the Common Text Sounds from Wired. That's a very interesting documentary on all those iconic sounds that we hear when we turn on our phone or listen to something on our phone, some alert sound. Mention The Merchants of Cool. And then a few other examples of branding and sonic design, so you can check all those out. So I think a really great selection this week of both our readings and also our media. So take advantage of all those opportunities to post in your text discussions as well as your open discussions. Now, next I thought I would focus on a performance context. So I've talked about this opera in the past, this opera called Weiter, which I did ages ago back in 1991. And I specifically wanted to look at this because we haven't talked so much about performance, either from the context of what happens in a performance setting or even, say, discussing giant music festivals where maybe we're interested in trying to understand how people come to appreciate a band by engaging with them in those performances. You can think about the rich culture that has developed out there, the subcultures going back to Heavy Metal Parking Lot, that great documentary that we talked about ages ago in this class. Seems like ages ago, a few weeks ago. Also, think of Deadheads and that whole culture of people touring with the Dead, the openness that the Dead always had to people tapping into their mixing boards to create their own mixes from concerts. I mean, really shows you how the fandom connected to a particular type of performance, a band, an artist, can really connect with certain values and lifestyle associations and politics as well. So what I'm including here is just this performance. I'll give you the link to it this week, or actually maybe I'll just include it here inside of the lecture. It'll be a little easier for you to watch it. And these are just selections from part of this opera. And one of the things I was interested in is just trying to engage you with the challenges of doing a performance. This was recorded with, open microphones, not very good setup, video cameras that were not professional by any means. This whole thing was mixed and remixed over time, and over time the whole thing has gotten very much grainy. I actually need to look at, there's a company out there that makes a video upscaler. I'd be curious to see if it would actually work in this case, if I could put it through that and maybe transform it. So I'm showing you just some of the context of the music here. I've shared some of this with you in the past as far as what the performance setup was like. And this diagram here and the musical sources I discuss, it's really part and parcel to kind of talking about performance this week. And I've summarized some issues on this topic for you here. We can think, as we talked about with the Dead, the audience itself and their connection to the performance. We can think about the rehearsal. Everything that goes into rehearsing for a performance is just as much as important to that performance, because obviously you attend as a concert goer, you listen to your favorite band or artist and you think, well, this was really easy to accomplish, but think of all the rehearsing and songwriting that goes into any given performance. The performance itself has various contexts. I'm thinking about the tragedy that happened at the Astroworld Travis Scott Music Festival in Houston in 2021. So many people dying, unfortunately. That's a very unfortunate context of a performance where you might have something dangerous going on. We've had situations, a Who concert ages ago, I think in Ohio, a bunch of people were trampled to death. So concerts themselves can be very dangerous. When you think about a mosh pit or people at that second Woodstock with Limp Bizkit and all those other bands where people were being raped and assaulted and damaging property and so forth, performance can often have a very negative context to it. So it's not always positive. There are technical aspects. So when you're doing a performance like this one I was involved in here, we had to think about how to mix live instruments, acoustic instruments, mic them, mix that to try to get a good mix with the electronic instruments. Not an easy thing to accomplish, let me tell you. And then also the aspect of recording it, as I said here. And if you look back on old recordings, sometimes maybe you're not pleased with them because they've aged over time. Although I think there's a certain nostalgia or charm to some of those recordings as well as they age, and we look back at them and we look back at how we've changed as a performer or a composer, and how the media has changed and how musical taste has changed and how the audience taste and its role in a concert or performance has also changed over time. So kind of a little nostalgic look here for me. So let me just insert this clip from Weiter for you to listen to some of these samples. So again, that was Weiter giving you a sense just of this context of performance, and wanted to include it this week because I think it's a really significant issue that we haven't touched on. If you'd like, in the open discussions for this week, you can focus on your own concert experiences, maybe small clubs versus big clubs versus stadiums, concert hall versus a musical performance that's like a punk concert or something, and how these differ in some senses in terms of your expectation as an audience or as a performer if you've been involved in performing in those contexts. So we'll kind of close out this week on a couple of issues. So first off, if you have any questions, of course, about the readings, the media this week, or certain contexts I've discussed in this video, this lecture, please reach out and I'll be happy to cover some of those with you. Now, secondly, let's really gear up for our projects. We're now into week 10, and so we're getting really close to the end of the term. So we just want to make sure we do a good job on the projects. Again, I've sort of stated some warnings in the past, not to scare you, but just to really say that the projects are a huge part of your grade, and so you should definitely do a good job on the project. Now, the dates here, don't pay attention to these dates. These could actually change just based on when you're taking this class, since I've recorded it in 2021. But I really want you to look at this module. This talks about the components of your project. So this discusses everything that you have to have in there, the grading scale, the rubric. Secondly, I've created a video for you. This describes how you should record your projects so that you can present these to the class on our discussion board. So this is using Canvas Studio, which is found in your Canvas class. Very easy to use. You'll maybe find it here on the menu or on the sidebar. And so watch that video to learn how to do this recording for your class project. There are also going to be a series of Zoom sessions that I'm holding for you, so you can stop in one of the Zoom sessions, and then you can specifically ask me questions or ask your colleagues in the class questions about your project, since we're getting near the end here. Also, when you're ready to post your project, you'll hit reply here. You'll post the project here, and then you'll also do a 250-word discussion that describes what you learned. So you can start it off with your narrative, and at the end, include the link to your video. If you do it on Canvas Studio, you're going to link that through our class site. If you do it on YouTube or some other means, if you upload it through the media recording tools and upload tools, you can also upload it here to our discussion board. So reach out if you have any questions about how that works and you have any concerns about the media side of things. Again, let me say this about project quality, and I'll just kind of read this because it's super important. I just don't want anyone to turn in a project that doesn't fulfill their requirements. So as I say here, as mentioned in our syllabus, the final project is worth 50% of your grade, or 350 points. It includes your proposal, which you've turned in already, the what you've learned discussion, the project itself, and then the Canvas Studio video, again, around 15 to 20 minutes. Because the project is 50% of the course grade, I really do expect complete and high-quality projects that reflect the required areas discussed on the syllabus in terms of the rubric that I've shared with you. I am not grading these pass-fail, so low-quality projects will receive point deduction. So if you turn in a low-quality project, don't assume that you'll still get an A or B in the class. Again, I really expect super high level of work because it's half of your grade in this class. So it's not the time to spend an hour on your final project. You might be lucky to get a D in the class if you do that. And I'm being very serious about this. What this means is that because the project is weighted so heavily, low quality projects will take the final course grade to C, D, or F level. This is meant as a reminder because in some cases projects may be turned in my classes that don't reflect A or B level work. Reach out during the course of your project work. Check with me to see if your project will meet my required levels of quality, so please attend those Zoom sessions to ask questions of me. This could also include sending me some of your PowerPoint slides if you're using them, graphics, media slides, etc. Anything sonic, share that with me. If you plan on doing anything with technology, using music and sound, please check in as it could probably help you out with the technology hurdles. Good luck with the project. I should also say that you receive comments on your projects. As I say here, your project proposals will turn in. I gave very specific and detailed comments to all of you when I graded your projects. I give you some important insights that will assist you in completion of the project in the class. Reach out if you have questions about my grading comments. In some of your cases, I may have said to you, you need to fix this, you need to do this. So the deal is, if I've said that to you, that's what I have in my head when I'm grading your projects. I'm going to be looking for that. If I grade your project and you didn't address what I said to fix, or a gap that I noted, or even maybe saying, I would change this project and not do this part of it or do something else instead, and you don't do that or don't address that, again, that's going to be a failure on your part in terms of not addressing the person who's assessing your work. I'm really looking at this as one might do a juried art performance or artwork or composition, looking at it in terms of its completeness. So I really do expect high quality projects. So definitely reach out to me. If you haven't attended one of the Zoom sessions, might be a great opportunity for you to jump on and attend one of those, because they are provided for you to really ask some important questions, to get some help so that you can ensure that you're going to receive a high quality grade, which is generally an A or B on the project. Not to scare you there, but hopefully just to motivate you some, because I don't want low quality projects to be turned into my classes ever. Inevitably, it happens. You're independent, you're working, you know quality, you know my expectations, they're super high. I'm not expecting you to turn in stuff that is kind of low quality, because it's not going to get a good grade. So please reach out. I am a little concerned just in general, because I think that if I don't hear from some of you, I'm worried that maybe you've forgotten about this aspect, that you really should get some feedback from the professor in the class to make sure that you're doing a good job on this project. Because once you post that video, I'm not going to say then, okay, make some changes, post it again. When you post the final video and your narrative, the project is turned in, and I will judge that work and assess it and give it a grade. So reach out if you have any questions about your projects or anything else in the class. And we'll be back once more with a final video in the class when we cover week 11 work here in the Anthropology of Music and Sound. Thanks for listening, and good luck with work on your projects.